It all started when I was 17. I remember the day clearly, as if it had just happened. It was the kind of day where the air felt thick with tension, like a storm waiting to break. I was standing in the hallway, watching my parents argue, the shouting growing louder with each passing minute. My mom was in the living room, tears streaming down her face, and my dad was pacing in the kitchen, his hands clenched into fists. I didn't know it then, but that was the moment everything changed. The argument had started over something trivial, a lie I had told about where I had been the night before. My parents had always been strict, but I wasn't prepared for the way they reacted when they found out the truth. That night, I had been with a group of friends I didn't even know well, trying to fit in with a crowd I thought would give me the sense of belonging I was desperate for. We had smoked, drank, and done things I wasn't proud of, but in that moment, I was a 17-year-old trying to figure out who I was, trying to prove something to myself and the people around me. But when I got home, I was caught. My mother's sharp eyes had already caught the scent of alcohol on my breath, and she demanded answers. I had never been good at hiding things, and instead of admitting my mistakes, I lied. I said I was just with my friend Sarah at her house, watching movies, when in fact I had been out with people I didn't even know. My dad, who had always been the more reasonable one, was quiet at first. But once the truth came out, the anger in his voice was unmistakable. "Why didn't you just tell us the truth?" he asked. "Why lie?" That question made something snap inside me. I had always felt like I was living in the shadow of my parents' expectations. They wanted me to be perfect, to excel, and to follow their rules. I had always tried to be the good daughter, the obedient one, the one who never made waves. But that day, the weight of their disappointment hit me harder than I had ever felt before. I didn't care about the lie anymore. I didn't care about what I had done the night before. What hurt the most was the feeling that I could never live up to what they wanted, that no matter how hard I tried, I would always be just short of perfect. And then came the ultimatum. "You're no longer part of this family," my father said, his voice cold and final. "You've broken our trust. I can't look at you the same way anymore." I froze. My heart stopped beating for a moment. My mother, who had been silently crying, finally spoke. "You've gone too far this time," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know who you are anymore." There was no yelling, no fighting, just a quiet finality to their words. It was like they had already made their decision, and nothing I said could change it. I wanted to argue, to tell them it wasn't as bad as they thought, but I couldn't find the words. I didn't want to explain myself. I didn't want to beg for their forgiveness. So instead, I turned and walked out of the house, out of their lives, without looking back. I remember the cold air hitting my face as I stepped out into the night. It felt like I was walking out of the only life I had known, as if I were stepping into a void, unsure of where I would end up. I didn't have anywhere to go, no friends to turn to. I just kept walking, as though the act of putting distance between me and them would somehow make everything better. I didn't know it then, but that night would mark the end of my childhood and the beginning of a life I hadn't planned for. For the first few weeks, I stayed in a cheap motel, using what little money I had to get by. I was too proud to call anyone, too embarrassed to admit that I had no place to go. My pride, which had always been a barrier between me and my parents, now became a barrier between me and everyone else. I didn't want their pity or their help. I convinced myself that I was better off alone, that I didn't need anyone. I tried to find odd jobs, anything that would give me some money to survive, but it wasn't easy. The streets were harsh, and I had no skills, no experience. I worked in a diner for a few weeks, but the pay was barely enough to cover food and shelter. There were nights when I couldn't afford to eat, and I spent hours walking the city, trying to find a place where I could sleep without fear of being attacked. I didn't hear from my parents during those first few weeks. I had left without saying goodbye, without leaving a note. I think they were too angry to care, and I didn't blame them. I was the one who had broken their trust, who had shattered the image of the perfect daughter they had hoped for. I wasn't sure if they even remembered me, but I often wondered if they thought about me at all. Did they miss me? Did they ever regret what they had done? Or had they moved on completely, forgetting that I had ever been a part of their lives? The loneliness was the worst part. I was surrounded by people, but I felt completely isolated. I would watch families walking by on the street, families who still had a place to go, a home to return to, and I felt a deep ache in my chest. I had cut myself off from everything that had once given me stability, and now I was paying the price. There were nights when I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if they had ever truly loved me, or if I had just been a disappointment from the start. But even as I questioned everything I had known, I refused to go back. The shame of returning, of admitting that I couldn't make it on my own, was too great. As the weeks turned into months, I began to adjust. I found work as a waitress in a small cafe, a job that didn't pay well, but kept me afloat. I rented a small room in a rundown apartment building on the edge of town. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Slowly, I started to rebuild my life. I made new friends, people who didn't know me as the daughter of strict parents or the girl who had it all together. They only knew me as the person I had become. I started to like myself again, to feel like I wasn't defined by my past. But the pain of being disowned, of being rejected by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, never fully went away. It was always there, lurking in the background, a reminder of how easily everything could slip away. I learned to survive, but I never forgot the feeling of being abandoned. It was a wound that healed only on the surface, but deep down, I knew it would never fully go away. I didn't reach out to my parents. I didn't want to reopen that door, but I kept thinking about them. I wondered what they were doing, if they missed me, if they had forgiven me in their hearts. But I couldn't ask. I couldn't bring myself to beg for their love again. For years, I lived in a kind of limbo. I had a life, but it wasn't the one I had imagined. The family I had known, the people who had once been my entire world, were now strangers to me. I was alone, but not lonely. I had built a new life, and it was mine. But there was always that question in the back of my mind. Could I ever go back? Would they ever take me back? And so, for the next 11 years, I continued to live in the shadow of that moment, wondering if things could ever be different, if I could ever be more than the person who had been cast out. But the truth was, I didn't know. And it wasn't until much later that I would finally find the courage to return, to face the family that had once disowned me, and to seek the closure that had eluded me for so long. But that would be another chapter, another story. For now, all I had was the memory of that night, and the harsh words that had changed everything. The first few months after I left home felt like I was swimming in a dark and endless ocean, unable to find a shore. At 17, you're not supposed to feel so completely alone in the world, but there I was, a teenager with no family, no safety net, and no real sense of direction. Every day was an uphill battle. I was a kid with too many questions and too few answers, struggling to stay afloat in a world that seemed indifferent to my existence. I remember those first nights in the dingy motel room with a sense of numbness. The mattress was thin, the sheets smelled faintly of mildew, and there were cracks in the walls that let in the cold from the outside. I didn't care. I had nowhere else to go, and at that moment, the physical discomforts didn't matter. What kept me up at night wasn't the cold or the hard bed, but the thoughts that ran through my head like a relentless storm. I thought about my parents, about how they had abandoned me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow I deserved it. I had lied. I had betrayed them, and in my mind, they had every right to turn their backs on me. In the mornings, I would wake up and walk the streets, searching for something to fill the emptiness I felt inside. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew I needed to find it. The days blurred together. I applied for jobs, but it seemed like no one wanted to hire a 17-year-old with no work experience. My pride made it even harder. I didn't want to admit I was struggling, didn't want to reach out for help. I wanted to prove that I could survive on my own, that I didn't need anyone. But survival isn't as glamorous as it sounds. It's about taking what you can get and hoping it's enough. I eventually found work in a small diner on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The owner, a grumpy man named Dave, wasn't particularly kind, but he paid me enough to get by. I spent my days waiting tables, cleaning dishes, and doing everything I could to stay busy. I hated it. It wasn't what I had imagined for myself, and the work was exhausting. But there was something oddly comforting about the rhythm of it all, the routine of waking up, working, and then returning to my small room at the end of the day, only to repeat it all over again. I remember the first time I made a friend there. Her name was Lily, and she was a few years older than me. She had a tough exterior, with piercings in her ears and tattoos on her arms, but there was something about her that made her approachable. She was the first person who ever asked me how I was doing, really asked. Most people at the diner didn't care about each other beyond the basics, but Lily saw something in me that no one else did. She wasn't perfect, but she understood what it was like to be lost. She had her own struggles, growing up in a broken home, battling addiction, and living in a constant state of survival. But there was strength in her that I admired. She taught me how to navigate the rough world we lived in, how to take care of myself, how to be tough when everything seemed to be falling apart. Lily became my first real friend after I left home. We weren't close at first, but as the months went by, we started to confide in each other. She told me about her dreams of escaping the small town we lived in, about how she wanted to move to the city and become an artist. I listened, not because I believed in her dreams. At the time, I didn't believe in anything, but because I was hungry for connection. For the first time in months, I started to feel like maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as alone as I had thought. It wasn't long before Lily introduced me to a few other people from the diner and the surrounding area. There was Josh, a quiet guy who worked in the kitchen, and Sarah, a waitress who had been in the town for years but dreamed of getting out. They weren't the people I had imagined myself befriending when I was still living at home. They didn't have the perfect lives, the neat little homes with white picket fences. They had scars just like I did. But there was something about their resilience that inspired me. They were surviving. They were making it work. And for the first time since leaving my parents, I started to feel like I could make it too. In the months that followed, I started to rebuild my sense of self. I wasn't the perfect daughter my parents had wanted me to be, but I was starting to become someone I could be proud of. I enrolled in a local community college, something I had always wanted to do, but had been too afraid to pursue when I was living under my parents' roof. I wasn't sure what I wanted to study, but I knew I needed to learn. I wanted to be more than a waitress, more than just a survivor. I wanted a future. The first class I took was a basic English course, and it felt like a small victory. It wasn't much, but it was mine. It was the first step towards something bigger. I spent my nights reading textbooks, trying to get ahead in my classes, and my days working at the diner. It wasn't glamorous, but it was enough to get by. Every paycheck felt like a small victory. Every day I survived felt like proof that I could keep going, that I could overcome the odds. Slowly, I started to put the pieces of my life back together. But there was always the question of what happened to my parents. They never called. I never reached out. Part of me was too proud, too angry, and part of me was too scared. The thought of hearing their voices again, of facing the shame of what had happened, terrified me. It was easier to keep my distance, to pretend they didn't exist, than to confront the reality of what had gone wrong. I tried to push thoughts of them out of my mind to focus on building the life I had now. The months turned into years. I worked my way up at the diner, eventually becoming a shift manager. I had a small apartment I could barely afford, but it was mine. I was no longer the scared, lost teenager who had walked out of my parents' house. I had a sense of purpose now, a routine, and friends who cared about me. I had a future, but deep down there was still a piece of me that ached for my family. The hurt didn't disappear, no matter how hard I tried to bury it. I missed my mom's cooking, my dad's old jokes. I missed the way our family used to feel, even if it had been imperfect. But I had no way of knowing if they ever thought about me, if they regretted what they had done. I thought about contacting them, but I was too scared. What would I even say? I'm sorry. I didn't feel like I was the one who needed to apologize. It wasn't that I wanted to hold on to the anger. It was more that I had built this new life, this new identity, and I wasn't sure who I would be if I allowed my parents back into it. I was someone else now. The person I had been before no longer existed. I had created a new me, one who had learned how to survive on her own, one who didn't need anyone to tell her what to do. But even as I said these things to myself, I couldn't shake the thought that something was missing. The hole my family had left in my life didn't disappear, no matter how much I tried to fill it with work, with school, with friends. It was always there, quietly gnawing at me, reminding me of the pain I'd tried to forget. As I sat in my small apartment, surrounded by books and papers from my classes, I realized that I couldn't run from my past forever. No matter how far I had come, no matter how much I had achieved, there was still one chapter of my life that I hadn't closed. The chapter that began the moment I walked out of my parents' house. And so, after years of silence, I decided that it was time to face the truth, to confront the family I had lost, and to find out if there was a way to heal the wounds that had been left behind. But first, I needed to be sure that I was strong enough to do it. I needed to know that the life I had built on my own was solid, that I wouldn't crumble under the weight of the past. And so, I kept moving forward, not knowing when or how I would return, but knowing deep down that someday, somehow, I would have to face what I'd left behind. 11 years. 11 long years had passed since I walked away from everything I once knew. 11 years since I had last seen my parents, since I had stepped out into the unknown, carrying nothing but the weight of my mistakes. I had rebuilt my life in the years that followed. No longer the scared, angry teenager who had run away, but a woman who had learned to survive on her own terms. I had a job, an apartment, friends who had become my family, and a future that was finally starting to feel like it was within reach. And yet, despite all of this, there was still one thing I could not escape: the question of whether or not I would ever return to the family I had left behind. The decision to go back was not an easy one. In fact, it felt like one of the hardest decisions I had ever made. I had spent so many years convincing myself that I was better off without them, that I didn't need the parents who had disowned me. I had built a life that didn't rely on them, and for the most part, that was enough. But something inside me had changed over time. The anger had faded, replaced by a quiet longing. It wasn't that I wanted to go back to the way things were. No, that would never happen. What I longed for was something else: closure. I needed to know whether the wounds of my past could ever heal, whether my parents could ever look at me without that old hurt and resentment in their eyes. I had been preparing myself for months, slowly convincing myself that I was ready. The thought of seeing them again filled me with dread, but it also stirred something inside me, a flicker of hope that I hadn't allowed myself to feel in all these years. I had to know if they had changed, if they had forgiven me in their hearts, if they even remembered me at all. I didn't expect a warm reunion, and I certainly didn't expect things to go back to the way they had been before. But I knew that for my own peace of mind, I had to take the first step. It was a cold morning in late spring when I finally decided to go. The decision had come to me gradually, like the slow unfurling of a flower, and I knew that I couldn't put it off any longer. I packed a small bag, not knowing how long I would stay or what I would say, and I set out on the drive to my parents' house. It was a long journey, and I spent most of it lost in my thoughts, replaying everything that had happened over the years, wondering how they would react to seeing me after all this time. Would they even recognize me? Would they remember the girl I had been before, the one who had caused them so much pain? Would they even want to see me again? The drive felt endless, the road stretching out before me like an open wound. I couldn't shake the nervousness that bubbled up in my chest, a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. I'd been so sure of myself for so long, so confident in the life I had built. But now, as I neared the house where I'd spent my childhood, I felt small again. I felt like the scared, lost teenager who had walked out of their lives all those years ago. What if they were still angry? What if they didn't care? The thought of being rejected again was almost more than I could bear. As I drove through the familiar streets, memories flooded back. Memories of birthday parties, family dinners, holidays spent together. I remember my mother's laughter, my father's stern but loving gaze. I remembered the way our house had always felt like a home, a place where I belonged. But that was before everything had fallen apart, before the fight, before I had been cast aside, a discarded piece of their lives. As I neared the end of the road, I found myself holding my breath, unsure of what I would find when I arrived. And then there it was, my parents' house, sitting quietly at the end of the street. The house looked the same as I remembered it, though the garden was a little overgrown, the paint on the shutters slightly faded. It was as if time had stood still in the years I had been gone, but for me, everything had changed. I had changed. I had grown into someone I barely recognized, someone who had learned to live without them, someone who no longer needed their approval. And yet, here I was, standing in front of the house, wondering if I could ever go back to the place that had once been home. I parked my car at the curb and sat there for a moment, staring at the house. My heart was pounding in my chest, my palms slick with sweat. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Slowly, I got out of the car and made my way up the path to the front door. My footsteps felt heavy, each one echoing in the silence of the street. I raised my hand to knock, but before I could, the door opened. It was my mother. For a moment, neither of us spoke. She stood there in the doorway, her expression unreadable. Her eyes, which once held warmth and love, now seemed distant, guarded. She looked older, the lines on her face deeper than I remembered. But there was something else in her gaze, something that I couldn't quite place. Shock, maybe. Confusion. Fear. "Mom," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to remain composed. "It's me." She stared at me for a long time, as if she didn't know what to say. And then, almost as if she had snapped out of a trance, she stepped back and motioned for me to come inside. I can't believe it," she said, her voice shaky. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again." I stepped inside, and the familiar smell of the house hit me. Freshly baked cookies from the kitchen, the faint scent of lavender from the soap in the bathroom. It felt surreal, like I was walking into a dream, one that I had never quite let go of. The house hadn't changed much, but I had. I could feel the weight of the years between us, the silence that had grown in the space where once there had been conversation and laughter. My father appeared from the hallway, and I saw the same shock in his eyes that I had seen in my mother's. He looked older too, his hair graying at the temples, his posture more stooped than I remembered. But the anger that had once defined our relationship wasn't there. He looked at me, and for a moment I could see the flicker of something in his eyes. Regret, maybe, or maybe it was just surprise. I couldn't tell. "You're back," he said, his voice hoarse. "After all these years." I didn't know what else to do. I replied, my words coming out in a rush. "I've been thinking about this for a long time. I just needed to come back to see if there was any chance. I don't know." I was trying to understand what happened. There was a long pause as we all stood there, unsure of how to move forward. Finally, my mother spoke, her voice softer now. "We didn't expect you to come back. After everything." "I know," I said, my throat tight. "I don't expect things to be the same. I don't even expect you to forgive me. I just needed to know if there was any chance for closure, for peace. For both of us." My father nodded, though he didn't speak at first. The silence between us felt thick, almost suffocating. But eventually, he spoke again. "We didn't know how to fix things with you. We made mistakes too. I hadn't expected an apology. It wasn't what I had come for, and I hadn't even known how much I needed to hear those words until he said them. The weight that had been sitting on my chest for so many years began to lift, little by little. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. "I don't expect things to go back to the way they were," I said softly. "I just wanted to know that we could both move forward, that we could understand each other again." My mother reached out then, hesitantly, as though unsure of whether I would welcome the gesture. But I stepped forward, and she embraced me, her arms trembling as she held me tightly. The years between us, the hurt and the anger, seemed to melt away in that moment, and for the first time in so long, I felt like I was home. We stood there for a long time, my mother holding me, my father quietly watching us. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that this moment, the one I had never thought would happen, was a beginning. It was the first step toward healing for all of us. And with that, I realized something. I hadn't come back to fix the past. I hadn't come back to rewrite history. I had come back to let go of it, to move forward. And in that moment, I knew that I was finally ready to let go of the anger, the resentment, and the hurt. It was time to make peace with what had happened, and with the family that had once been my whole world. It's a strange thing, try to rebuild a relationship after so many years have passed, after so much damage has been done. The human heart is resilient, but it also holds on to its wounds in ways that sometimes surprise even the people who carry them. After my return, I had no illusions. I knew that what had been broken between me and my parents could never be fully fixed. I wasn't expecting a fairy tale reunion, but I hoped for something real, something that could begin to heal the years of silence, resentment, and confusion. We spent the next few days together, but in a way, we were all tiptoeing around the elephant in the room. There was no rush to get to the heart of things. Instead, we navigated the delicate space between us. Small gestures of kindness, simple conversations. These were the building blocks we used to piece together something we had lost. But despite the efforts, there were moments when I could feel the weight of the past between us. The history hung there, a constant reminder that time doesn't always heal wounds. Sometimes, it just lets them fester until you're forced to confront them. I could see the pain in my mother's eyes, even when she smiled at me or made small talk in the kitchen. She wanted things to be better, but I could tell that the hurt she had carried for so long wasn't just going to evaporate. And my father, he was quieter, more withdrawn than I remembered. The anger I had expected to feel in him had softened into something more complex, something I couldn't quite name. Regret? Guilt? Whatever it was, I could tell that he had been carrying a burden of his own, one that had weighed on him in my absence. There were times when he looked at me, as if measuring whether it was even possible to forgive me for leaving, for breaking our family. Our conversations were halting at first. It wasn't easy for any of us to find the right words, to navigate the tangled mess of emotions that had built up over the years. I didn't know what to say to them either. I had spent so many years learning how to live without them, how to fill the space they had once occupied in my life. I wasn't the same person who had left that house all those years ago. In a way, I wasn't even sure if the version of me they remembered still existed. On the fourth day after my arrival, things started to shift. I had spent most of the day with my mother in the garden, helping her tend to the flowers and shrubs she had always loved so much. It was a simple task, but in the quiet rhythm of it, we began to talk. Not about the past, not about the things that had happened between us, but about the small, mundane moments that had defined our lives. She told me stories about her childhood, stories I had never heard before, little things I had never noticed about the house, about the way my father had once been before he became so distant and angry. And I found myself telling her about the years I'd spent away from home, the struggles, the heartache, the small victories that had carried me through. It felt almost like we were strangers, learning to know each other again. But in that strangeness, I felt something begin to shift. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of understanding. Later that evening, after dinner, I found myself sitting on the porch with my father. The air was cool, and the sky had begun to darken, the stars emerging one by one. For a long time, neither of us spoke. I could hear the soft hum of the crickets in the distance, the rustle of the trees in the wind. The silence was heavy, but not uncomfortable. In that moment, it felt like we were both trying to find the right words to say to each other, but neither of us knew where to start. Finally, my father spoke, his voice rough, like he hadn't used it much in years. "I don't know how to make up for what happened," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I don't know if there's even a way to fix it. I don't know if you can ever forgive me." I felt a lump rise in my throat at his words. For so long, I had told myself that I didn't need their forgiveness, that I didn't care what they thought. But hearing him say that, admitting his own regret, shifted something in me. It was like the last of the walls I had built around my heart were starting to crumble. "I don't expect you to make up for it," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't expect you to fix everything. I just needed to know that you still cared, that there was a chance for us, even if it's just for us to be okay with what happened. For both of us to stop carrying the weight of all that anger." He didn't respond right away, and I thought for a moment that maybe I'd said too much. But then he turned to me, his face softening, and his eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. "You were right," he said slowly. "I was angry. I was hurt. I couldn't understand why you left, why you cut us out of your life like that. But I never stopped caring about you, even when I didn't know how to show it." The words hung between us for a long time, and in that silence, I realized something. There were no easy answers to the pain we had all felt, no quick fixes for the years that had been lost. But the willingness to acknowledge the hurt, to speak it out loud, was a step in the right direction, a step toward healing, even if it wasn't perfect, even if it wasn't enough. I don't want to keep fighting, I said, the words coming from somewhere deep inside me. I just want us to be okay. I don't know if we'll ever be the same, but I think we can be something else. We can figure it out. For the first time in a long time, my father nodded, his eyes filled with something that almost looked like peace. It wasn't complete, not by a long shot, but it was the start of something. And that, in and of itself, was enough. The next few days passed in a quiet kind of rhythm. We didn't talk constantly about the past, but when we did, it was different. There were no accusations, no blame. Just two people, three if you count my mother, trying to understand one another, trying to make sense of the years we had spent apart. My mother apologized in her own way, offering the kind of quiet acceptance that only she could give. She didn't have grand speeches or dramatic confessions, but she didn't need them. Her sincerity was enough. One evening, after a quiet dinner, I sat with them both on the couch, the silence comfortable this time. My father had his arm draped over the back of the couch, my mother leaning into him. For the first time since I'd come back, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging. It wasn't the same as it had been before, but it was real. The love we had once shared hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed. It was no longer about perfection or old expectations. It was about acceptance, accepting each other as we were in all our brokenness. "I'm glad you came back," my father said, his voice low and steady. "Me too," I replied, my heart swelling with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "I think I was just waiting for the right time. Tom has a funny way of working things out," he said, giving a small smile. "Sometimes it just takes longer than we want." "I think that's true for a lot of things," I replied, my voice softening. The conversation drifted into silence again, but this time it wasn't a heavy silence. It was a peaceful one. We sat together in that moment, not needing to say anything more, content with the understanding that had begun to form between us. The days that followed were not without their struggles. We all had our moments of doubt, our moments when the old wounds flared up again. But we also had something we hadn't had in years, a willingness to work through it, to move forward. And that, in itself, was the most healing thing of all. As I left their house to return to my own life, I realized that this was not the end of the story. It wasn't the final chapter, nor the resolution I had once imagined. But it was the beginning of something new. A new relationship with my parents, a new understanding, and a new sense of peace that I hadn't had in years. We would never go back to what we had been, but we were finally able to move forward. And in the end, that was enough.